the Militant Thomist. Christian, thanks for joining us.
Yep. How are you doing?
Good. Always love watching your videos. Always great commentary and having a lot of fun while you're doing it. So excited to have you on the show. Probably the best time you could be on, right after Fr Ripperger.
Yeah. There you go. I've been thinking about one time talking to Fr Ripperger. I think he'd steamroll me though.
With what?
Oh, he's just like, you talk to certain people, and they have a certain type of like mastery of rhetoric where they're just able to, plow right through. It was like that when I talked to Jay Dyer. I mean, it's different types of rhetoric, obviously. Fr Ripperger and Jay Dyer aren't exactly, pulling the same sort of rhetoric, but it's still sort of like a dominant personality, I guess. So I think I would get steamrolled in any sort of disagreement that we would have, for sure.
Do you feel like are there any disagree? Like, what are the things you like best that he does? Maybe some of the things that are like, well, I don't know.
Yeah, so with Fr Ripperger, I had watched a lot of his content on virtues and vices. He actually was really the one that got me so interested in moral theology, because I listened to his stuff on moral theology, and I mean, he was connecting every little thing together in a very reasonable way. And I was like, oh, well, where did he get this from? And obviously he was getting it from St. Thomas, or at least the moral manuals that are basing themselves off of St. Thomas. So that was actually a very early introduction that I got to scholasticism. This was way before I was Catholic. Well, not that much before. So I guess like 5 years ago, maybe I was listening to some of his stuff on morals. I mean, everything just kind of fit together and made sense. And eventually I figured out, there's stuff like this for dogmatic theology as well, which would be the scholastic teachings on matters of faith, not only on matters of morals. Fr Ripperger was actually somebody quite early as a quite early interaction that I had with Catholicism. But I mean, when it comes to disagreements, like, yeah, they're there. I mean, sometimes I don't like the way that he phrases things, but I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of things that he wouldn't like about the way that I phrase things, the way that I carry myself about. As to like doctrinal disagreements, I think that sometimes he states an opinion which is fine to hold. It's perfectly okay to hold, but he doesn't adequately clarify for people that this is his position that he's holding to. And this isn't a position that is universally held by all Catholics. And you can be a good Catholic and disagree on a certain point. But yeah, generally speaking, I love Fr Ripperger, and I think he's been absolutely a net good.
Oh yeah, and I always say he's kind of almost like the gateway drug into like learning about the tradition of the faith. And then unfortunately, some people take it the wrong way, and then some people keep it on the rails, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Talk about your faith journey and intellectually how you became a Catholic. Like, what was that process like? Because you know a ton. I really appreciate the sharp distinctions you always make. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so I grew up in a Baptist-y sort of context. It was technically non-denominational, but it wasn't like the type of non-denominational that you're thinking of, like the light show lasers, fog machines, not that type. It was kind of more like what we would think of as like independent fundamentalist, although it also was like a little bit Calvinistic leaning. So it was basically like a mini John MacArthur type church, I guess, if that would be the best way of approximating the sort of nature of the church and the type of teachings and the type of preaching. So from a very young age, I mean, I was in a household that was quite religious. We went to church every Sunday, Bible studies during the week, things like that. And there was also like a religious culture surrounding that as well. Even in a profane way, there would be illustrations taken from Scripture and things like that, to where we were very much exposed to sacred Scripture, and we understood, at least generally speaking, its contents quite well. So that was actually something very helpful for me in my later life that I would come to appreciate, is that I had a very intimate knowledge of Scripture from a young age. I mean, I remember early middle school, late elementary school, like reading through books of the Bible, just kind of in my free time. Like that's just something that, there's something you did. And I'm sure I wasn't acquiring the sense of the text that well, but I mean, that exposure was still at least something, at least some sort of foundation. It wasn't until probably, I want to say 10th grade, 9th grade, that, because I'd say I was a little bit more lax in my practice. I mean, it kind of comes with being in that environment of really a sort of free grace, easy believist type mentality, at least among the average person. Like we've sort of assented to the facts of the gospel, and therefore, since we've assented to the facts of the gospel, we're eternally secure, and kind of doesn't really matter how you practice your religion. Doesn't really matter at all. It really just matters that you at that one point, and kind of if you want to, you can have like a DLC add-on of various religious practices that you can do on a daily or weekly basis. So it wasn't really until 9th or 10th grade that I started to get more interested in religion. And my parents bought me a MacArthur study Bible. So like the study Bible, I think it was an NIV. It had like all the notes, and like all of his notes in the bottom. And I've very voraciously read through that. I still remember the just massive, probably in the garage right now, but there's just a large amount of markings that I would take and I would read through it. At that point, I was pretty studious in high school. I was very interested in mathematics. Like I was, a junior in high school, and I was taking like the second year college math courses, the 200s level stuff. Like I was very, very interested in mathematics. That's what I wanted to do. I didn't know whether it was going to be in some field like finance or something like that, or a more academic way. But I would say in about end of junior year, that's when I started to get to a very serious level religiously. I realized that studying theology was kind of all that I liked to do. That's all that I wanted to do. I actually my parents weren't happy about it, but I actually kind of overnight was just like, yeah, I don't like studying math anymore. And I just completely like slacked off all of my courses and stuff like that, and I just got like terrible grades. I'd never gotten a C in my life, and I got like a C in all of my math courses from end of junior year, and then in senior year when I still kind of did it just because. So yeah, end of junior year and then into senior year, I was pretty interested. At this point, I was discovering the broader Reformed tradition outside of John MacArthur. I began, listening to all of the R.C. Sproul tapes and stuff like that. I got into I got first introduced to Reformed scholasticism, which for those who don't know, it's a movement between the late 16th to 18th century of various different Reformed authors who would write in a scholastic method. So this was kind of like my first introduction to scholasticism in a Reformed context. Although I still not convinced to this day that it was real scholasticism, as I would generally refer to it as. I do think that, weirdly enough, the moral stuff that I was listening to from Fr Ripperger was kind of the first taste of like really real scholasticism. So yeah, and then I went to college. I was intending to go into the ministry, and when I went to college, as any young Reformed individual is aware of, once you get to a spot where you're like, okay, I'm generally Reformed, I'm kind of just like still at my parents' house. Well, once you leave your parents' house and you kind of don't go to their church anymore, you're not like a differently believing person within whatever church you happen to be at, but you actually have a choice now of which church that you want to go to. And usually the three choices are, do you want to be Reformed Baptist, do you want to be Presbyterian, or do you want to be Anglican? And I studied around, and I thought about it a lot. I attended a Presbyterian church for a while just because, That's what most of my roommates were doing. And then eventually I was like, okay, well, I think Anglicanism is probably the best choice because at this point I started to become a lot more interested in tradition, ecclesiastical tradition. I thought that the episcopate was kind of weird because I didn't really see it in Scripture. But it's also strange how early it popped up within the church. As many know, St. Ignatius writes about the three orders of ministry and very clearly outlines the fact that they're distinct. So at that point, I was like, okay, well, Anglicanism is probably my best option. That, and it gave me a bit of latitude. Because within Anglicanism, at least practically speaking, the general bounds of belief are pretty wide. They're pretty broad. So I could have a little bit of room to learn. As I was sort of expanding my range, and also at this point, because I wanted to join the ministry, I started working in an Anglican parish and started the process of ordination. Talk to everybody you need to talk to, and blah blah blah. Did all that stuff.
So you had a Bible background. You're Baptist, but now you're attending Anglican services. You're reading the Fathers and listening to Father Ripperger all at once?
Yes, actually. I was very interested.
I just want to make sure I got that straight.
Oh, yeah, because basically, to kind of explain a little bit of the background, when you're, it happens a lot when people make these sort of religious changes, like within Protestantism. Like, let's say they want to become Lutheran or they want to become Reformed or whatever. It's very frequently occurs while they're still in high school, that they just go to whatever church their parent is going to. So, I mean, I was Reformed for a while. My parents at that time, we'd left the church that I grew up in. My parents were at a charismatic church. So that's the church that I went to every Sunday when I was in high school. So yeah, when I went to college, it gave me the opportunity of like, okay, well, I'm Reformed, but like, what kind of Reformed do I want to be? So that's the background for the whole Anglican thing. So yeah, at that point, I was Anglican. I was, I, at this point, kind of made my first entrance into the online scene, a very old blog that I used to do. It was mostly for posting the papers that I was writing in college, some of the interesting research points that I had, some things that I was studying at this point. But I never really was interested in YouTube for I think about a year and a half, 2 years maybe after that. I can't remember the exact dates. But at this point, yeah, I was just kind of doing random articles. They weren't that good. I'm sure if somebody dug into the way deep archives, I'm sure they could find they could find some of these articles. They probably weren't that great. And I was just generally talking to other people in my spheres that were other types of Reformed. I had friends who were beginning to get interested in Roman Catholicism. I was kind of very comfortable as an Anglican. They were reading a lot of Roman Catholic authors. They started reading St. Robert Bellarmine. We even started to get introduced into authors like Cajetan. Trying to think, obviously St. Thomas. We were all reading St. Thomas at this point. And
are they talking to you about Bellarmine and what they
we were all talking about it. Eventually, we all were very convinced of certain views of Roman Catholic. We weren't Roman Catholics yet, but we were interested in certain views of Roman Catholic authors that were incompatible with the traditional Reform view. We were all kicked out of college. So technically speaking, I didn't graduate in undergrad.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
All right.
I don't think I've ever talked about that.
You know a ton more than most people who graduated college. Keep going.
Yeah. So we got kicked out for supposedly being heretics. Although most of us were just like, hey, we're still like Protestants, and we still, broadly speaking, agree with like things which are allowable within like the broadly Protestant tradition, classically speaking. And then it was probably after that point, I want to say, I can't remember exact dates, but less than a year, maybe like 7, 8, 9 months, somewhere around there. By that point, we all were Catholic. So yeah, by that point, we were all just like, okay, This is probably real. We're kind of coping here. was a sort of my. I was the last to go. To be fair, I was the last to go. Everybody else saw the light much before me. I was the last one. But yeah, that was a pretty painful decision, I would say, because up to this point I'd been ordinand. So that means that I was pursuing ordination. The way that my college functioned, they didn't really want me to go to, my bishop at least didn't really want me to go to seminary, which seminary is usually what you do after undergrad, at least in their world. So I would get my theological education at an undergrad institution, and then I would get my pastoral training kind of hands-on with my priest. So yeah, that was obviously something that I had to give up. I had to, when I became Catholic, because at this point I was married. I was married to my wife.
How long ago was this that you became received into the Catholic Church?
Received in the Catholic Church 3 years ago.
Wow, and that was what? And then, so you just finished school, going to school, not that 5 years ago?
Yeah, I started. Yeah, that's when. Yeah.
Man. That's nuts. What do you think pushed you over the top? Was it the logic? Was it it's a combination of everything. It's hard to pinpoint. Of course, God's grace first and foremost. Was it like the fathers, you feel like, where you saw these men were Catholic, or?
I would say that a lot of it was. So the type of, it's kind of hard to explain to outsiders, but the type of Protestantism that I came from was actually very concerned with ecclesiastical authority. They were very concerned with tradition. They were very concerned with the sacraments. So it was a higher church Protestantism. And what I kind of realized, especially when it came to ecclesiastical authority, I usually like to phrase it like this. So in a few decades after the Reformation, there was a group called the Nonconformists in England. And the Nonconformists, they basically thought that the Church of England, under Queen Elizabeth, they thought that the Church of England was corrupt. They were passing they believed various things that were out of line with Scripture. One of those examples is actually the episcopate. So the episcopate's not in Scripture. We don't care if it's in tradition or not. But we're following the reforming of the church to its purity, which is why they were known as Puritans. The reforming of the church to its purity in accordance with Scripture. So we're going to disobey you guys on the principle of the reforming of the church by Scripture. And you had a very famous work written against these guys. One of them's famously known, his name is Thomas Cartwright. And the famous response was by Father Richard Hooker. And Hooker, he pointed out to these guys that, hey, we don't just, think that you can go and do whatever you want with Scripture. We believe, he said that Scripture and nature teach, natural reason by nature. Scripture and nature teach that in order for the resolving of ecclesiastical disputes, even over the interpretation of Scripture, you need the authority of the church. Everybody needs to assent to the authority of the church. So I think almost immediately everybody realizes the hypocrisy that has always been present within these traditions, is that you have very high ecclesiastical authorities well before the Reformation determining certain teachings which are contrary, judging on certain teachings which are completely contrary to what the Reformed believe, to what Protestants in general believe. And even during the time of the Reformation, you had a dispute over the sense of Scripture and of the tradition of the Church, and you had an ecclesiastical judge, the Pope, and then eventually the Council of Trent, judge on this matter and say, hey, you guys are wrong on this, come back into the fold of the Church, here are the true teachings. And then our theologians went and explained the teachings, supported them from Scripture and tradition, and so on and so forth. So it seemed to me completely hypocritical if I were to pretend like I am this special form of Protestant that's not like the other Protestants, because we believe in ecclesiastical tradition, we believe in ecclesiastical authority, obviously, as the Church has always believed, yet on the other side I'm going to defend the Reformation as being legitimate. The Reformation was completely illegitimate from those reasons. And I think the hypocrisy is shown out from the history of the Protestants.
Yeah, it just takes a high degree of intellectual honesty and a real search for the truth, and a continuing to read on all those topics, right? I mean, what would be your advice just to giving a Protestant or a Baptist, like, what would you say to them?
Yeah, I mean, it's extremely difficult, because if you do want to go the route that I went, which looking back, I don't think it was ideal. Because the route that I went was basically like, okay, well, I'm going to look through something like the Catechism, and I'm going to find everything that I disagree with, and basically I'm just going to study each one of these issues and kind of figure it out. Like, are the Catholics right about this? Are they wrong about this? Where can I read more about this? And so on and so forth. And that's basically what I did, is individual doctrines that I was studying. It was way too much. I was way in over my head. I definitely didn't give a proper reading of basically almost any issue. I definitely don't think that I studied enough on any one of these issues. If a man were to study exhaustively on every single one of these issues, he'd never convert. Because there's just so much material that is present throughout the tradition. So I think a lot of it actually comes down to St. Augustine's method against the Donatists, which he wrote a work on the unity of the Catholic Church. And basically, his method was, hey, let's look into Scripture and see what Scripture teaches about the Church. Scripture teaches about the church that it looks like this. And he would go through all of the Old Testament prophecies about the future church. And he said, okay, well, look outside of yourselves, look around you. Which body of Christians exemplifies what Scripture teaches? So I think that's definitely the most helpful. And this is the method of the marks of the church. And this is very frequently treated in our apologetic manuals. I mean, if you want to if you don't want to go through all that work, and you kind of want the TLDR, Father Joseph Clifford Fenton, his work Laying the Foundation, Handbook of Catholic Apologetics and Fundamental Theology. It's a very good work, because it treats it in a very scientific and rigorous way. I think the way that I went about it was completely wrong, and if I were to do it all over again, I probably would have it done in like a month. I'd be converted in a month. And I mean, I think it's good perspective, at least for me, because now a lot of people reach out to me and they're like, hey, I'm coming from a Reformed background, Lutheran background, Anglican, whatever background. I'm coming from this background. Could you help me out? Could you let me know about this or that? Could you let me know what your advice is for this type of reading? And now I'm better able to, I guess in a pastoral way, better able to direct them to what I think is useful from my own bad experience of doing things completely wrong and taking forever to even know which questions to ask.
Oh yeah, and I think I just heard recently E. Michael Jones talking about that on baptism and against the Donatists, those are like good solid material for where the structure of the church, the hierarchy of the church. He was talking about it in the context of combating radical traditionalism. I didn't read the works, but would you say that's the case?
Absolutely. St. Augustine, he kind of has three, besides his like sermons and exegetical writings and individual theological writings, he kind of has three major polemical collections. One is against the Manichaeans, so this is going to be about like the goodness of creation. The second one, which probably is the most extensive, it's very long, but against the Pelagians. Against the Pelagians, I think it's like 23 or 24 different works. It's a lot of different works. So this is going to be on grace, justification, predestination, issues like that. And the third collection is against the Donatists. So the story is very interesting, but I won't get into it entirely. I eventually want to do a video on the history of the struggle between St. Augustine and the Donatists. But the Donatists were a group of North Africans who saw the Catholic Church as corrupt, saw the Catholic Church's bishops as traitors because they handed over the books during persecution. They saw our ordinations as invalid because of the immorality of our bishops and our priests, and they saw us as being lax So from all of these reasons, they basically formed a schismatic church of the pure. And that's what they were concerned. They didn't want all of the impure throughout the Catholic Church. And that was basically the big issue. And for a very long time, the North Africans were losing to the Donatists. I mean, most of the North African Christians were Donatists. They had, I think, 500 bishops by the time of St. Augustine. It was a huge movement. And the North Africans cowered. I mean, we had clerics and we had a bunch of individuals basically abandon North Africa to the Donatists. It was really bad. But then you had, in the late 300s, you had St. Augustine and St. Aurelius of Carthage, who stepped up and fought against the Donatists. And St. Augustine has this very interesting, again, I wish I could get into it more, there's a very interesting episode in his life where he debates 500 Donatist bishops at once. He shows up and he's like, hey, can you bring like a few representatives? So him and I think 2 other guys show up to this council, like, hey, bring a few representatives and we can talk it through. And we can figure out who's right and who's wrong. We're going to have this debate, basically. It was meant to be a debate. And they show up with all 500 of their guys. And they're like, okay, well, let's debate. Like 3 against 500. So St. Augustine gives his arguments. They talk for a few days, and they bring these refutations. And St. Augustine, on the spot, just destroys all of their arguments.
What a boss.
Like, this secular judge was there, like, witnessing it all. And he was like, this was the most amazing, like, refutation ever. It's a great story, but St. Augustine stood up to the Donatists. Fought the Donatists. It's really because of him that the North African church didn't disappear, him and St. Aurelius of Carthage. But yeah, their works generally concern ecclesiology, the authority of bishops, the authority of councils, the nature of the church, reconciliation to the church, ordination, things like that.
Wow, awesome. All right, and then how did you get the name Militant Scotist? Militant Thomist, Hammer of Scotist.
Yeah, the Hammer of Scotist.
Cajetan, right? You said.
It was kind of it was originally ironic. Most people don't know this, but it was originally meant to be a bit of a joke because James White. Actually, my first big break was James White saw a video that I did on Twitter because somebody said they were going to accept the perpetual virginity. Because I did a video on the perpetual virginity, and this must have been 3 years ago. It was a while back. I did a video on the perpetual virginity. James White saw that I did it, and James White saw that I mentioned him during the video because I said that his arguments were stupid. And he didn't like this, and he referred to me in that video as a militant Thomist. So that was originally it was a joke to call myself a militant Thomist and make fun of James White. And then eventually, like, this whole thing started to get, like, I never imagined that I would have any sort of following or anything like that or make any sort of money off of the internet. I never imagined that would be a thing. I honestly had no idea. When I converted, I went back to my old job at Walmart. Like, when I converted, I was like, I don't know what to do. I mean, I got mouths to feed. I don't know what to do. I mean, I worked at Walmart and I DoorDashed, and in my free time I'd study theology and occasionally make a video. That was what I did back then. I had no idea that it would amount to anything. But eventually, there was kind of a realization of like, hey, there's starting to be people who are following me. This is getting a little bit wider than people could even realize with the joke. So I changed the channel name to Scholastic Answers, and the Militant Thomist thing is only something that people will occasionally call me, and it's still my email name. So I kept the original email.
That's awesome. Okay, so talk about what does it mean to be a Thomist? Because there's different aspects of it, right? His methodology, his actual theology, and the way he presents things. There's a lot of people who everyone loves to be a Thomist. It's a very sexy thing to say I'm a Thomist.
Yeah.
But are they truly Thomists? How would you define things?
Yeah, there's definitely a very broad way in which people will speak of Thomism. And in a sense, and people have gotten mad at me before, like, in a sense, it could be as broad as saying that every Catholic, in a way, is a Thomist. Because St. Thomas has more authority than any other doctor of the Church. St. Thomas has been praised by very many popes with the highest praises. His doctrinal positions on issues that the Church have not decided yet are considered to be safe. And even in the canons of the Church historically, St. Thomas's doctrine and method are set forward as what ought to be taught to seminarians. So in a way, we can talk about every Catholic being a Thomist, because, and this kind of confuses people, because people get the wrong idea, and they're taking Thomist in a univocal sense and say, oh, well, you think that every Catholic should necessarily, or every theologian should be bound to necessarily affirm whatever St. Thomas affirms. It's not what I'm saying. It's not what I'm saying at all. Really what I'm saying is that the relation that, let's say, a Franciscan has to St. Thomas is different than the relation that a Dominican has to Blessed Scotus. Blessed Scotus, he's like, he can kind of interestingly take from Blessed Scotus and say, oh, well, that's cool, he's interesting. There's no real, Scotus isn't a real authority for a Dominican. But for a Franciscan, St. Thomas is still their common doctor. So if that makes sense for people, that's what that is indicating. So broadly speaking, we can say in the broadest possible sense, every Catholic is a Thomist, as long as by Thomist we mean somebody that has a degree of reverence for the teaching and general authority of St. Thomas. It would not lightly depart from one of his teachings.
Could they say, well, we have an advantage because we know where you're coming from, but you don't know where we're coming from?
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, I guess a Franciscan has to be trained to think like a Thomist to some extent, right? Just by being Catholic, right? Mm-hmm. But a Thomist doesn't necessarily have to be trained at all to think like a Scotus, right? Because it's not.
Yeah, it is very. Yeah, that's a good point, because the thing is,
I have to live in your. They have to live in your world.
yeah, exactly. There is a degree. Yes. So I guess there's an unfair advantage in that way. But yeah, there's a degree of piety that is owed to the common doctor of the Church that is not owed especially to the doctors of other schools, because traditionally speaking, each one of the orders have their special doctors. For the Dominicans, it's St. Thomas. For the Augustinians, it is Aegidius Romanus and St. Thomas. For the Franciscans, for the Jesuits, it's actually St. Thomas. For the Franciscans, it is Alexander of Hales, St. Bonaventure, and Blessed Scotus. So each one of the orders have their special guys that they follow, but there is a degree of general reverence had for St. Thomas that is unique. So yeah, that's in the broadest possible sense. Now, we can kind of restrict that a bit too, because due to this general reverence that is owed for St. Thomas, and due to the fact that there are particular orders which take him on as their teacher, you can have, in a way, following Aegidius. For example, you're an Augustinian, you're following Aegidius Romanus. Mm-hmm. You can say, I am an Aegidian Thomist. I am a Thomist who follows particularly the teachings of Aegidius. Or, you're a Jesuit and you like Suarez. It's a very popular author to like as a Jesuit. I'm a Suarezian Thomist. I follow the teaching of St. Thomas as interpreted by Suarez. So those are all fine definitions. I mean, if you want to say, well, I am an eclectic Thomist, which basically says I have a general sort of degree of following to St. Thomas, but I don't follow him too closely. Like, I agree on the primaries, but kind of everything else, I'm coming up with my own positions on things. So there's broad ways in which you can speak about a Thomist. But in the most narrow technical sense, what it means to be a Thomist is to follow the teachings of St. Thomas as they are interpreted within the Dominican order. So the Dominican order has a long line of commentators and interpreters of St. Thomas who provide a general sphere of interpretive groundwork. So yes, there's differences between different types of commentators. They'll disagree on very particular issues of how to interpret St. Thomas, but there's a general sphere of interpretation within the Dominican order, especially, I want to say this was after the time of the battle between Durandus and Natalis, which would have been early to mid-14th century. So since this time, there has been a general reverence for following St. Thomas, and even slightly after his death, I mean, there were degrees within the Dominican order to follow the teaching of St. Thomas as completely unique, and there was a early time of battle where there was a guy named Durandus who wanted to fight against that authority, and another guy named Natalis just destroyed him and made him rewrite his commentary on the sentences, which are massive, 3 different times. So after this point, it was pretty indisputed within the Dominican order. But yeah, generally, broadly speaking, that's what it means to be a Thomist, in the strictest sense, is to follow the teachings of St. Thomas Aquinas insofar as they are interpreted within the Dominican order.
And that would include basically those three big works of St. Thomas, the commentaries and the sentences, the Summa Theologiae and the Summa Contra Gentiles. Who were those commentators that you said were the ones for each?
Oh, yes. So there are basically there's the three monarchs of Thomism, if you want to put them like that. So in the 15th century, there was a man named Jean Capreolus. He was a French Thomist. I think he died in like the 1450s, although I'd have to look more into that. He wrote the first big defense of St. Thomas Aquinas. This is kind of he provides the general interpretation of St. Thomas that is basically taken on most issues throughout the history of the Dominican school. He wrote a commentary on the sentences, or really basically a commentary on the sentences, but he just kind of ransacked the rest of the works of St. Thomas to get all the other quotations, and then answered particular objections given by other medieval scholastics against St. Thomas. And then you have, in the late 15th, early to mid-16th century, he worked for a long time, but Thomas de Vio Cajetan, or just Cajetanus, a lot of people refer to him as. He was Italian, northern Italian. He was actually cardinal, and he's the guy at Worms who faced off against Luther. Interestingly enough, so he has a history of a lot of interesting things. But he wrote a famous commentary on the Summa. He wrote some commentaries on works of Aristotle's Ad Mentem Thome, which basically just means according to the mind of Thomas. He wrote Bible commentaries, which kind of were a little bit shady. Near the end of his life, he got a little bit shady on some issues from his interactions with the Protestants. And he wrote various different polemical works against Protestantism. And then for the third one, it's Sylvester Ferrara. So Sylvester Ferrara, he was also so Cajetan was cardinal, and he was the head of the Dominican order. Ferrara was the head of the Dominican order after Cajetan, I think, so same time frame. And he wrote a commentary on the Summa Contra Gentiles. So these three works basically form the nucleus of everything else that's going to be said in the tradition when it comes to Thomism. They basically, any major position can probably be traced back to those three. And then two other major figures, if you kind of want to round it out, is in the Baroque period, which was after the Council of Trent, starting 1570s, 1580s, and going for about a century. You have a group of commentators on the Summa who fought a lot and wrote a lot. This was a time of Suarez, who I mentioned earlier. They fought a lot, they wrote a lot, they got things very, very precise, very fine detail, very long works. This was the time in which we were fighting, the Molinists and the Thomists were fighting. This was the time of Louis de Molina and the Congregation de Auxiliis. This was all of that fighting time that we had. But there was a theologian who kind of crowns, I guess you could say, the jewel of Thomism during this time would be John of St. Thomas. I actually just did a biographical video if anybody's interested. But John of St. Thomas, he's known as the Second Thomas because while he was not like a foundational figure like the last three I mentioned, he certainly was the most faithful and erudite exponent of St. Thomas, and he that's ever been. And I mean, he wrote a 3-volume Cursus Philosophicus going over all of the issues of philosophy, and then a 10-volume Cursus Theologicus. He only finished the first 8, but the last 9 and 10 were compiled from his notes by his student. But yeah, John of St. Thomas, very faithful, erudite. And then the next generation, we kind of get a little bit less development going on within the scholastic, within the schools. But what is advantageous of this is that you have a lot of the bounds being drawn. We had so much just like bloating and expansion of just people just writing crazy amounts of just pages and pages and pages of stuff. And then you kind of had this period where it's like everybody, weirdly enough, agreed to stop doing a bunch of development, and let's just take a breather and kind of just like draw the battle lines again, which is basically what occurred. So these were some of the great systematic figures within Thomism. Bill Awart is probably the best example of this in that era. Bill Awart, he was a French Thomist. I'm actually translating one of his works, which are very good. It's called the Summa Summae, which is a 3-volume sort of systematic treatment of Baroque scholastic theology. It's one of my favorites for sure. But yeah, that and I think that would probably be about it. After this point, you have a little bit more decay. You have basically Thomists are kind of just repeating what has been said and then fighting various different heretical groups like the Jansenists or rationalism or whatever. And the next period comes like the Thomistic revival in the Leonine era. That would be like 1880s to 1950s. And this is a bunch of people kind of reaching back and trying to grasp the go back to the Baroque period and grasp the magic that made so many just brilliant, smartest people ever to exist happen to be within the same city in Salamanca, Spain, fighting each other at the same time over Christian theology, which is just it's a blessing because we're just standing on the shoulders of absolute giants who were all sharpening each other at the same point.
So should an aspiring Thomist start with St. Thomas and then those 3 monarchs, the commentaries, or should they start with someone who's something more modern that's synthesizing all that together in a easier format? I don't know. Is Garrigou-Lagrange, is he lockstep with them or 90% lockstep with them?
The Garrigou-Lagrange, he was an excellent, wonderful gift that God gave to the church. He wrote a lot of work on systematic theology, everything from fundamental theology to Mariology to Christology to doctrine of God. He wrote on mystical theology. He just has so many great, excellent, fantastic works. But, and there's going to be a but here, but he does tend to overly, and I'm trying to be pious here to a great father in the faith, but he does have a tendency to over-restrict the Thomistic tradition, and this caused some blind spots, I would say, with how he interacted with other figures within the Thomistic school of his time, most famously Father Francisco Marin Sola. So I guess I would absolutely, everything Garrigou writes is 99% wonderful, excellent, beautiful, and I love it. A good place to start is his work Reality, Thomistic Synthesis. I think that's a very good intro work for a lot of people. For aspiring Thomists, I mean, your first step is to learn Latin. I mean, that's always your first step, because once you learn Latin, it just opens up a lot more. And if you already know Latin, read the Summa Summae by Bill Awart, or there's another figure named Gonet, his Manuale Thomistarum. That's a very good work to read. These are like syntheses written by these first-class Thomists, and it's really excellent that they wrote these syntheses. Edouard Hugon, his Theologia Dogmatici, I think it's Tractati Theologia Dogmatici. Yeah, if you just look up Edouard Hugon, it'll come up. His because we refer to everything in Thomism to their cursus. It just means like their course or their like group of books, basically. So like, their cursus, and they usually all name it Cursus Theologicus. So when you have those names that are that are not Cursus Theologicus, you have to think for a second. But yeah, Edouard Hugon, he has a 3-volume cursus that's very good. But again, it comes down to whether you know Latin or not. So learn Latin, and in the meantime, reading the works of St. Thomas are always fruitful, are absolutely always fruitful. I would not suggest, because I know that I would get asked about this, but I would not suggest reading these. So this right here is a 3-volume translation of Thomas de Vio Cajetan's commentary on the Summa. It's excellent that we have it in English. It's just a very to retain my piety to a man who's much brighter than I, but it's not that good of a translation. In many places, it's misleading. So yeah, it's better to just read something more mundane than to read something that's badly translated, at least in my opinion, because it can cause some bad habits, especially if you're just starting out. You don't want to get into the wrong terminology or way of thinking or anything like that. But yeah, if you're an aspiring Thomist, your first step is learning Latin. Sorry, that's just the if you don't want to learn Latin, then you can pick up, I don't know, bread making or sewing or something. I don't know. Pick up something else. don't pick up the one thing in the world where 99% of its literature happens to be in Latin still. That it's not really a good thing for you to pick up. If that's
makes
your
sense.
mindset.
Now I know what you're going to say here, but how much should an aspiring Thomist study Aristotle, because he was one of the great lights, at least for natural reason, for St. Thomas? Should we be reading him at all? Should we be reading St. Thomas's commentaries on him? Do you go through the Organon, because maybe that doesn't have theology? What's your thought?
Yeah, so when it comes to Aristotle, there's two things to remember. One is that Aristotle's works the works that we have from Aristotle now are basically like his study notes from his lectures. It's kind of funny because you read early Peripatetics, and they're talking about how beautiful the works of Aristotle are, and then you pick up Aristotle we have now, and you're like, what? Like, what are you talking about? Well, they're talking about his dialogues and other works that he had written, because he wrote many, many different works. We only have access to just a tiny bit of them, and they're just basically all really crappy lecture notes that are very confusing unless you have somebody explain them to you. So that's the first thing to remember, is that we're not exactly on a good start in terms of legibility when it comes to Aristotle, and that's because of the nature of the works. And second, when it comes to the medievals actually had a slightly different Aristotelian corpus that we have. So there are many works that are Latin Aristotle works, which are basically works that were falsely attributed to be Aristotle's that aren't Aristotle's. So when it comes to the study of philosophy in relation to Aristotle, I actually wouldn't really suggest heavily diving into Aristotle, unless, I mean, if your goal is you want to be a Thomist and specifically focus on philosophy, like, I could see that definitely being fruitful. But it's better to just read a later Thomist writing on philosophy and the explanations they give. It's going to be a lot more legible, a lot easier to read, a lot more fruitful, and won't have like some of the weird Aristotelian ways of phrasing things and the weird Aristotelian kind of style and things like that. But yeah, I mean, if you want to a lot, like, knock yourself out. With the Organon particularly, we actually have multiple medieval works, which are basically Summa Logicae, sums of logic. So we have William of Ockham, we have Pseudo, which the first two books are translated, the third one isn't. The Pseudo Thomas Summa, which somebody wrote a Summa Logicae in the name of Thomas, which is actually very Thomistic, so it's a good source to have. And that's all translated. And then third, you have Peter of Spain's Summary of Logic, which I think all of that is translated. So I mean, in logic in particular, there's a lot of good resources to read. Because St. Thomas himself only comments on interpretation and the prior and posterior analytics. He doesn't comment on all the books of the Organon.
Okay. And then around beginning of the 20th century, roughly, we started to see more of the theologians wanting to, I don't know about break, I guess maybe break, going outside of the neo-scholastic tradition. I guess they saw a green light to study Bonaventure. I guess starting with Bonaventure, do I have this right, that St. Thomas basically started with, experience, and like he kind of took it from natural knowledge, whereas Bonaventure started more with, okay, we understand there's the Trinity from divine revelation, so like building it out from there. Did he start from what we know from divine revelation, and St. Thomas kind of took it from the ground up, or am I way off?
It really depends on what work you're thinking about, because there are different methods, I guess you could say, of presenting theological conclusions. So there's like a method where you basically start with whatever is most evident to the articles of faith. So what, like, immediately you can draw forth from the articles of faith. That would be one method, and this is usually a very good catechetical method. You go through the articles of the creed, and you explain what each one of the articles mean, which heresies are denied by each one of the articles. St. Thomas does this in his commentary on the Apostles' Creed. He does this in his commentary on the Lateran Council. There's a few different places where he does this. And another place would be to present things insofar as they are connected amongst themselves. So you start with the most fun, rather than starting with like what is closest to faith, the virtue of faith. You actually start with what is closest to really the order of things, how they logically proceed from one another. So like a good example of this would actually be when you look in Prima Pars, you look in the tract on the Trinity, which is question 26 and following. You see that he first discusses the processions, because the processions are actually the foundation for real relations, and real relations cause relative opposition causes real distinction, which is the foundation for the persons. So St. Thomas moves from procession to relation to personhood. And it's not because procession is more obvious than relation, which is more obvious than personhood. To be honest, personhood is probably the most obvious thing. But in the actual order of things, procession is logically anterior to relation, which is logically anterior to personhood. And there's other places where he may present it in different ways, such as the Summa Contra Gentiles, where he's producing the things of nature first, natural reason, because it's an apologetic handbook, and then he's going on to the things of faith. It really is just a kind of work-dependent thing. And St. Thomas, no matter which work he's writing, and he has a reason for why he's ordering it in a certain way, and he usually tells you why he's ordering it in a certain way. But yeah, I don't think that generalization is correct, because both of them were extremely concerned with knowing things via divine revelation, and that's when it comes to like the principle of knowing. But the principle of like pedagogical presentation of, okay, let's take our conclusions and communicate it to people. It's going to differ work from work to work.
Okay. All right. And how should we view, I know we spoke about this off the camera before, but about how the theologians like Balthasar, Rahner, de Lubac, I mean, different people, different stance on things, some of whom I think during the pre-Vatican II period claiming to be Thomists, right? Mm-hmm. Transcendental Thomists. How should we view them? How do we put any of that in perspective? And even like the communio theology, the Eucharistic theology, how do we put that all in perspective?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what we have to realize is that basically the period from, I want to say 1840, 1850, around there, to 1950, 1960, this was a period of great renewal within the church when it came to the type of sources that we had access to. So the example that I like to give, because this is kind of a funny example, I would say, is the example of Gregory Palamas. So Gregory Palamas, he's an Eastern Orthodox theologian who was in opposition to Rome. He's one of the pillars of orthodoxy for the Eastern Orthodox, very popular figure. But who were the first ones to go through all the manuscripts of Gregory Palamas' works and to make critical editions of it? It was a Latin. The Latins were the ones who went through all of these different Eastern Orthodox figures and made critical editions of all of their works, or at least made some sort of print edition of all of their works. And actually it was us going through, getting all of these works, making editions of them, commenting on them, and then giving them back to the Eastern Orthodox. They hadn't really had primary source access to a lot of these individuals until we gave them the theologians back. And it just kind of led to a weird historical interpretation, because they interpreted it like our which in a few ways were slightly wrong. So they just took the wrong reading that our theologians had of their theologians and then just said, yeah, that's orthodoxy. It's really a strange story with that one, but it's kind of a story for a different day. But basically, this was a period of great retrieval throughout the entire history of the church. So you see, for a great example of this would be the works of Cardinal Johann Baptist Franzlin. from the 1860s to 1880s, I think was when he's writing, or of Shaven. Shaven's another figure. Great period of retrieval, going back to a lot of the sources. We were having access to systematic presentations of the Church Fathers, of the medievals. It was a period in which we did a lot of primary source work. So during this period, you had a lot of really great secondary source work going on and great primary source work going on. So that is the context in which the Nouvelle Theologie, which are the figures that you're referring to, the Nouvelle Theologie arose. They arose in a context in which they were particularly known for the great, fantastic, excellent historical work that they were doing. We have to remember is that when you look at manuals that were written in the 40s and the 50s, these guys are being quoted as authorities, or even into the 60s. These guys are being quoted as authorities. They're being quoted as, these guys are great historical theologians. They're doing a lot of great work. But they did have particular theses that they were bringing out. They had particular views that they held on to, and conclusions they drew from their historical work. So the theologians at the time, the scholastics at the time, the way that they basically approached it is they used all of their great historical work. They used all of their great their great secondary source material, but they were very careful about the conclusions that they drew. Because in many cases, the conclusions that they drew were either not sufficiently precise. So the theologians of the time were like, okay, well, this is what you're saying. If taken in this sense, like it's not cool. But we need to be very careful about what you're saying here. Or in many cases, the thesis ends up just being wrong. So we value the type of good work that they put in. We have to be careful with the unique contributions that they're making. And this is something which is not at all unique to the Nouvelle Theologie. Very many times throughout the history of theology, you have eclectic figures who attempt to come in and to state a new position on something. And that's fine. You're trying to figure out a new solution to old problems in submission to the magisterium, in line with divine revelation. It's okay. It's called being an eclectic. Being an eclectic is completely fine. There's no sin in being an eclectic. We have to be careful is that eclectic positions are meant to be judged by the mature. So the theologians in their journal articles or monographs, which monographs are basically long journal articles, about 100 to 150 pages. So in their journal articles and their monographs, they would discuss these issues amongst themselves as theologians who are already formed, as competent men who could consider these problems. But the issue with the 1960s and on, and to this day, it wasn't the fact that they were presenting these new ideas. It's completely fine to be an eclectic. It was the ideology that we should be very free in presenting our new conclusions to the masses, especially to seminarians. So in a previous age, when you had these new ideas which came forward, theologians would dispute it, and it'd be fine. Eventually, maybe it would be a position that a lot of theologians would like, and therefore it would be included as a small portion, a scholia, within the general theological manual. And maybe eventually a lot of theologians like it. And eventually there's a consensus on this. It's so good there's a consensus on it. And then maybe eventually the magisterium of the church decides to step in and maybe give some sort of approbation of it. That's completely possible. That's the way that authentic doctrinal development happens. But the way that authentic doctrinal development doesn't happen is you try to brainwash all the seminarians into holding all of your views with insane rhetoric, which I know I've been very respectful to a lot of these people, but that's what they did. In the 60s and 70s, they tried to overturn the entire tradition with rhetoric, with the way in which they spoke very nastily about the previous tradition, which are foundational for a lot of the myths that we have about the preconciliar theology to this day. So yeah, that's generally speaking. I think that I have a very balanced position. I think I have the same position that the theologians before the councils held about the Nouvelle Theologie. I just need to grab my charger.
Sure.
Wouldn't want me disappearing halfway through, right?
I don't even think I have my microphone. Do you hear my microphone? I'm like,
yeah, I can hear your microphone.
Oh, okay. It didn't look like it was on here for some reason. I thought it was just going through the computer. Yeah, no, because I was thinking with these guys before, like you were saying that it's more those guys were schooled with Thomism or Neo-Scholasticism, right?
Yeah.
So like Ratzinger, JP2, who were talking about communio and Eucharistic theology, they had this solid foundation, whereas their students didn't. I don't know if it was them personally, but the people in their cohort who were teaching, they weren't teaching with that solid foundation, or was the cohort following that?
Yeah. Basically, what happened is a lot of these, and it's crazy because you read, like Rahner, for example. Rahner was a Jesuit, and Rahner had a very high regard for theological manuals. A lot of these guys, in very many ways, had a high regard for theological manuals, for their content, and even in some cases for their method. Because you have to realize a lot of these guys were trained in seminaries in a certain way, in the scholastic method. And that's what made them great. That's what formed their native scientific faculties in such a way as to be able to produce such good quality work. And it's kind of a tragic tale because, and I think I'm justified in speaking this way, but basically what you see in the history of theology is you see this brilliant group of the Nouvelle Theologie. I mean, this would be obviously Benedict XVI and St. John Paul II would be included in this group, who you mentioned. But this brilliant group who were trained in this method and who had the scientific habits they had because of this, because they were trained in this way. And then once the council happened and a lot of the reforms were put into place, a lot of these methods of theology fell by the wayside and kind of came up to a almost nihilistic throwing of opinions at one another. So basically, everybody kind of has their own theological opinion. We don't have any sort of general way of acquiring certainty of who's right. We don't really have a way of coming to a consensus or any sort of agreement on any points. And this was very tragic. And the students following them were not trained in the same method. So they were given the matter. So they were given the matter from the Nouvelle Theologie, so what they were kind of saying, but they weren't given the form. They weren't anywhere near as brilliant. And you see this where, to now, I mean, you read a lot of these guys, and it's just completely unimpressive work. These guys aren't, they don't know 12 different languages and aren't, can quote like Bonaventure's fourth book of the sentences off their head when a certain problem comes up, like Ratzinger could do, or like even St. John Paul II, just brilliant, insanely well-read, very bright figures. And their students are, in many ways, just completely unimpressive. And a lot of the ones who are impressive do hold to the value of the older way of doing things. And a lot of the other ones are just riffing off of what had already been said in like 1942. They're saying the same thing that was already said in 1942 and pretending that this is unique or new, and holding to these just like kind of nasty rhetorical caricatures of how theology was before the council.
Okay. I had a whole list of questions I could ask, but I'm going to scrap all that. I'm going to save this as the last one. If you could rewrite the curriculum in terms of training students, for all Catholics, catechesis, seminarians, and just the entire mode of doing theology, you have the magic wand, and you could write the script. What would it look like? How would you have them rooted in that Thomism all at the same time? Well, because obviously things are said at Vatican II, and you do have these these theologians, so that we're able to have a proper development of doctrine and understand things, right? What would you do?
I would want nothing more than what basically every single council father of Vatican II wanted. When you look at and I've read them all, if you look at the votae that were written to the Second Vatican Council, especially the ones on education, and you read what did the council fathers going into Vatican II, how would they have critiqued the way in which theology was being done? Because theology was being done in a very good way before Vatican II. We were reaching some of the heights in the history of theology, some of the heights in many different areas of the greatness of our theologians during the 1950s. But there are definitely ways in which we could improve. And the ways in which a lot of the bishops said we needed to improve is that we needed to put manuals back in their proper place, which was not manuals were meant to be basically assisting books. Your seminarians would be reading them in private, not during the lecture or anything like that. They'd be kind of getting all the information of the who, what, where, why, when, how sort of stuff. They'd be getting, okay, well, these X number of fathers, these are the traditional scripture passages that we go to. You'd be kind of building up all the matter sort of within you, to kind of use that analogy.
The skeleton
and,
kind of.
Yeah, you're building up all of that knowledge that you're not just going to cover in class. Like, you're not going to go in class and say, hey, let me read off these 30 different texts from church fathers about the divine processions. Like, you're not going to do that. So that's the role of manuals. But the role of the magister, so the master in the classroom, is to interpret and to show the unity of theology through the exposition of a master text of theology. And that master text for the bishops going into Vatican II was the Summa of St. Thomas Aquinas. The Summa of St. Thomas Aquinas is ordered in such a way as to show the unity of theology and the way in which all of the different pieces and aspects fit together. That's the strength of the Summa. Even if theologians interpreted the Summa and disagreed with the conclusion of St. Thomas, it's the order of study that matters. It's the general way in which he fits together all of the pieces. So that's what the fathers going into Vatican II wanted. They wanted the manuals to be put in their proper places and the Summa of St. Thomas. So the students, when they were learning about the Trinity, rather than being thrown 10 different theses about the Trinity like the manuals did, and that's of course fine to throw 10 different theses and to show, okay, these are the objections, this is how we handle the objections, here are the definitions from the church, here's scripture, here's tradition. That's fine. It's fine to do that, of course, it's okay. But in the classroom, the magister is supposed to, through his teaching, by way of illustration, by way of corollary, many different ways, supposed to show how the entirety of the Catholic faith is this sort of beautiful unity. It's this sort of cathedral of truth. And that's what's supposed to happen in the classroom. So if there's anything that I could wave the magic wand and change everything on, it would be, okay, we need to update our manuals because it's been a while. Some of the last ones were being written in the 70s, but it's definitely been a while. We need to update these to stop just spouting out your random personal opinions in your theology textbooks for students. That's stupid. As a theologian, your obligation towards your students is to give the teaching of, one, the church, and two, your school. So if you're a Jesuit, you give the teaching generally of the Society of Jesus. If you're a Dominican, you give the general teaching of the order of preachers and the way in which they interpret St. Thomas and so on and so forth. That's your obligation as a theologian, not to give your own personal interpretation or your own personal opinions. It's to give the teaching of your order, to give the teachings of the magisterium of the church, and so on. There's been a lot of magisterial stuff that has happened in the last 70, 80 years since the great manuals were last being written. And there were a lot of different opinions that were being put forward that need to be particularly refuted. But we need to get those manuals updated and get those as assistant works for students in seminaries. And we need the Summa of St. Thomas Aquinas to be interpreted again. And this is just my lay opinion, but I'm not saying this because I'm particularly brilliant or anything like that. I'm saying this because that's kind of just what the bishops of the entire church wanted as the reform, and instead we got the tyranny of individual theologians who were all brilliant, but in many ways messed up the way in which teaching was done. I think if I were to wave the magic wand, that would kind of be what would be going on.
And then how do you start? Well, take your son. How would you start Augustine? How would you start exposing him to things?
I think what's important is, at least for kids in that age, it would be most of their exposure is going to be happening through the liturgy. So daily office, I love the daily office. I'm an Anglican ordinariate, so my daily office is a little bit different than the liturgy of the hours. It's going to be the reading of Scripture and the explanation of Scripture. I mean, the fathers universally talk about how Scripture is something where the image that Pope St. Gregory the Great uses is it's kind of like a river. You can have the little lamb kind of splash around in the shallows of the river, but the hippo also can like swim in the depths of the middle and can't touch the bottom. So Scripture is something that, in learning how to properly read Scripture, that's something that from a very young age is very important. And this isn't something that you need to be a brilliant mega genius for. You can be a kid and be reading Scripture and learning generally, like, okay, what are these Bible stories? What's the significance of them, both morally, allegorically, and anagogically? What is the significance of them for my life, for viewing Christ in them, for beatitude, for heaven? What's the significance to all of those things? I don't really have any extremely special thoughts on youth catechesis. I do actually really like the compendium of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. That's probably what I will use or adapt with my children. It's very, very good, and it kind of is a self-contained system too, because you can go to the compendium of the Catechism, then you can go up to the big boy Catechism, which is more so something appropriate for probably young teens would be able to they'd be able to read it with an assistant for sure.
All things equal, would you go with the compendium over like one of the more advanced Baltimore catechisms? Or it doesn't matter?
The only reason I would go with the compendium is I do want to instill in my children the fact that the stuff that the church produces is stuff that is relevant to us. And by the stuff that the church produces, I mean the stuff that the contemporary church produces. I think for a lot of people, and I've noticed this with individuals that I interact with on a daily basis, is, of course, the Roman Catechism is great. Of course, the Baltimore Catechism is great. Of course, all of these different historical catechisms of the church are great. They're amazing. They're wonderful. But what you lose is a lot of times you can cause a mentality of suspicion towards the contemporary magisterium of the church. What the magisterium of the church now gives us isn't good anymore, and we kind of need to go back and read the stuff that the magisterium used to give us.
Right. Okay. So would you do them in conjunction, or just go straight to the compendium?
I think for young children, at least, from my experience, I used to do catechetics as an Anglican. Repetition is extremely important, so I'd probably stick with the same text.
Okay. All right. And then when would you introduce them to the Summa? Is that a high school thing? Is that a college thing? Or is that more... I know it was made for beginners, which is...
Yeah, well, beginners were students who had studied arts already, so they were already actually bachelors in arts. They'd studied philosophy for probably 4 or 5 years at that point. So beginner means something a little bit different than for us. Which, to be fair, I mean, they started studying the arts at like 12, 13 years old, so it would have been our equivalent of high school students, late high school. But yeah, when it comes to the works of St. Thomas, what is excellent about them is that they're just so varied. I mean, there's different works that are basically applicable for children. There's other works that are applicable for younger adults. There are like things like the explanation of the Lord's Prayer, the explanation of the Hail Mary, explanation of these various parts, scripture commentaries. There's various different works within the corpus of St. Thomas that are easy for laymen, even uneducated laymen, to read and digest. And there's stuff that's very hard as well that could be introduced later on. There's actually an interesting side comment that's made during the canonization process of St. Thomas, that even the what is it? Even the ignorant would fight for to grab a work of St. Thomas, basically, because he was beloved by the laymen who would read his simpler works, such as his explanations of the Ten Commandments, Creed, Our Father, and Ave, and works like On the Reasons for the Faith, and certain sermons. There's his scripture commentaries. There's a bunch of stuff that people who aren't theological geniuses could be very accessible for them.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Christian. Great stuff. Really appreciate it. A lot of your work I see. I saw the whole series on development of doctrine. That was great going through, and double predestination, making the distinctions and explaining that. Just a lot of great stuff. Any other information, or where can we send people to find more information from you, your work, and what you have going on coming up?
Yeah, so I'm in the middle of a lot of different things. But yeah, I have a Twitter. It's mostly like a personal Twitter. I mean, I kind of just meme on it or whatever. I mean, it's not really like super official. Sometimes I'll do theology stuff on it. Sometimes I'll just troll people on it. I mean, it's kind of whatever. I have a YouTube channel, obviously, Scholastic Answers. I do live streams, some live streams during the week. Those are more supposed to be just like hanging out, more entertaining stuff. It's not really anything super dense. Some people like the live streams. Some people, I also do edited videos, which usually end up being more dense and are edited, concise, everything like that. Those usually are the ones where some people say, okay, well, I find live streams boring or whatever. I don't like that stuff. I'd rather just watch the edited videos. It's like, well, I do both. So, yeah, either one of those, I live stream and I post edited videos. And I also do, like, I've been translating stuff and I do works. Well, that is behind a paywall. It's on my Patreon. Is most of, like, my weird scholastic notes. Like, I've been chasing down something on a guy named Vincent Contenson and his particular view of what constitutes theology as a habit. So, I mean, if that's your sort of thing, I do post that on my Patreon, and I'm translating through Billiard Summa Sume on there as well. So yeah, those are the main places. I have a website as well, christianbwagner.com. That just has various things on there. But yeah, that's all the stuff that I do.
Awesome, Christian. I'll give you plus 2 helping with the tutoring. So I signed up for several tutoring sessions, and I'm sure we'll be doing it again. But it's been really helpful. I saw that. That's just a great thing that you're able to just. And I shoot all these kinds of questions at you, and you're knocking them down. So it's really helpful in your recommendation. So I'd strongly recommend anyone who watches to capitalize on that. It's you're a wealth of information and generous with your time. So I really appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Christian. Keep up the great work.
Thank you.
All right.